Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the NITheCS Colloquium on a rainy Stellenbosch afternoon. Yeah, welcome also to our online participants. I hope it doesn't rain where they are now. Yeah. This afternoon, I'm very happy to have to introduce to you Dr. Professor Igle Gledhill. Yeah. Igle is a long time, very good friend of NITheCS because she was the person who was very instrumental in writing the roadmap to NITheCS, yeah, or the transition from NITEP to NITheCS. And essentially, thanks to her hard work, we are here. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Yeah. So, but Igle not only writes reports for DSI and NRF and others, yeah, she's also a professor in, I read it here because I forget, in the School of Mechanical, Industrial and Aeronautical Engineering at WITS. Yeah? And for many years before that, she was active still in the area of computational fluid dynamics at the CSIR for many, many years. Yeah? At the moment, I don't read all the accolades of Igle, otherwise there would be no time for the colloquium. Yeah? But she's the a past president of the SIIP, so she was also instrumental in many innovations in the South African Institute of Physics, and at the moment she's the deputy president of vice president of the Academy of Sciences of South Africa. Yeah? And many, many more things that you're welcome to read on the announcement. Yeah. So Igle, thank you very much for coming the long way from Johannesburg. And we are very keen to hear what you're telling us about what we can do for women in science and in theoretical physics in particular. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much, Igle.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's a joy to be here. So I thought I'd start with 3 slides about who I am. Is the sound okay, everyone? Okay, good. I usually say, please wave your hand if you can't hear me. I have on the screen a picture of the Bloodhound supersonic car because I was able to do a little bit of work after it had established the land speed record at Huxteenpan in South Africa. They actually looked over Google Earth to see where the biggest, flattest place in a stably political country was to find out where they should run. So that work was actually linked to my interest in accelerating objects and shock waves around them, transonic speeds. Up at the left there, you see a rocket sled. It's very difficult to validate this computational fluid dynamics. The only way to do it really is with supersonic land objects or rocket sleds or ballistic. Yeah. Okay. Anything to do? Nope. Laptop seems okay. We're having a look at the presentation mode at the moment. So the center images are actually from a ballistic range in Japan at the bottom and from computations done in South Africa at the top. Right. Okay, that's always an interesting one. So people online, we are just figuring out why you can't see which one is in the middle. Yes, we should be there. Okay. Are we happy? Right. Now I don't seem to be able to move from here. Right, can I move from there? Nope. I can't change slides at the moment. So I'm going to need some help. Help. I just tried the arrows. Okay, so you'd like me to use the mouse pad? Yeah? No, the buttons are not working. Just going to check. Oh, they do work. What do you know? Right. Okay, that's the rocket sled top left, ballistic range in Japan bottom middle, and the computations above. It's always difficult to simulate that kind of thing. Right, and this is the work of a student, Sean Morrow, who is looking at what happens if you have an inverted wing in ground effect at transonic speeds. The left-hand column is steady state. The right-hand column is accelerating. And if you look at the bottom two pictures, you'll see that they are profoundly different. And if the shock is in the wrong place under a supersonic car, you have the risk that it may pitch up. And that is not what it was designed to do, we hope. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about humanity and the sciences, ways forward. What I'm going to talk about is trends and needs, the working environment, women in science. Much of what I'm going to say, though, is applicable to underrepresented groups of any kind and concerns that people have in minorities in the workplace. I've got some puzzles to ask you about. The reason I'm here today is because I had an unguarded conversation with Francesco in which I asked some questions and he said, well, come and find out the answers. So I'm going to ask you ways forward, and that comes from some of my experience working with the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics. I chaired the working group on women in physics for what seemed like a very long time. And I was involved in a major international experiment. So just a couple of things first. We are looking at ourselves here. Essentially, here we are in this universe, opening our eyes, looking around and interpreting what we see. The font changed, so I'm finding myself a bit at sea. Some of the trends, we need scientific impact and advice more than ever before. We're learning new methodologies. I've worked with social scientists on this work. It's possible to do transdisciplinary research. I've worked with anthropologists. I'm going to speak about physics sometimes just because that's my home, but I've worked with anthropologists and they think that physicists are a very interesting civilization. Worked with theory of change a bit, in which one really finds out what stakeholders actually want before you kind of trying to change the way they live. The community of practice of science, and by that I mean all of us here, is increasing its calls for fair treatment of scientists, often known as diversity and inclusion. And we actually need all hands on deck at the moment. So this is the fine print, but I made it a larger font. Gender is a broad concept. The binary focus is there because that's where my experience lies. Sorry that I don't know any more than this. A lot of these ideas apply to other group identities, and particularly NITheCS is an African institute in Africa. What does in South Africa? What does it mean to be an African institute in South Africa? And I think also in discussions like this, it's easy for things to go wrong. One can create polarization, a them and us kind of mentality. Cultural practices are deep, and I'm not criticizing. People feel offended very easily. I know how offended I've felt when people say women do this or that. They think in this way or that other way. That isn't the way I think. I think I have a unique mind. I think you have unique minds. But perhaps we can make some differences. It's easy to insult or micro-insult. And I hope not to do that because we're in this together. I put up a couple of histograms because in some cases, one is looking at differences between sexes. The left, and that's sex, not gender. Gender is the social concept, sex is the biological context. The left-hand one is about height. There are some differences there which can be observed. We also see some differences in distributions, as on the right-hand side. And generalizing can be downright offensive. I know that because I don't like to be generalized about. What I'm after is universal participation in science and universal access to the benefits of science, especially in Africa. Freedom of thought and freedom of thought to innovate. but freedom comes with responsibility. And the International Science Council has very good words on this subject. We all know that we like a conducive and inclusive environment that we can get some work done in. I think it's usual to mention the names of a couple of women when one's talking about gender in science. So Rosalind Franklin was the pen pal chosen by, what was his name? Christie, who was in solitary confinement during apartheid. He was allowed one pen pal and he chose Rosalind Franklin. She's interesting because at the Royal Society in London, her portrait is not of her face, it's of her hands, because those are what she used to do her science. C.S. Wu, of course, is another famous person who didn't win the Nobel Prize. And you might have met Evelyn Fox Keller. She came over to STIAS in 2011. She went and did physics at Harvard and was wolf whistled every time she walked into the lecture room. And she started to establish gender in science as a legitimate subject of inquiry, and now one has departments at universities. I don't claim to be in that class. Kathleen Lonsdale was a student of the elder Bragg, was the person who proved that benzene is flat. I see my font has completely got obscured, but I will make a copy of the presentation available. She was a pacifist, jailed for it. And thought leaders might always not be in positions of authority. Second picture there is Katherine Johnson, whose character was portrayed in, what was the film? Wonderful film about NASA. Hidden Figures, thank you. And Inge Lehmann, who discovered the composition of the Earth's core. Lisa Meitner, of course. I think Lisa Meitner said winning the Nobel Prize was not half as much fun as doing the work. And thought leaders tend to be respected whether they're recognized or not. Now, I'm going to move slightly from women in science to data and talk about the Gender Gap Project. It was started by the International Science Council, and it approached some of the wicked problems. A wicked problem is one that may not necessarily have a solution, that involves social issues, that is important to humanity. And we have wicked problems in natural science and in social science. This was a collaborative project. You will see over on the right-hand side that it had International Mathematical Union, IUPAC, right, let me go back, International Astronomical Union, the biologists, IUPAP for physicists, that's the Organization for Women in Science for Development, UNESCO, and History and Philosophy of Science. So there were 8 partners at the international union level, and it was such fun. I think people learnt enormous amounts. There were 3 tasks. First one was a global survey. I'm going to give you one slide on that, and perhaps I should get a 15-minute signal. The second one I'm going to talk about in more detail, a joint data-backed study on publication patterns, because that's where the puzzle lies. And the last one was a database of best practices, but only those that had been evaluated, right? You didn't get in if you hadn't been evaluated. The global survey had 32,346 respondents from 159 countries, about 7,500 physicists global, of whom about 37% were women. This was a snowball survey, so communities were not sampled. The word went from one to another. In fact, I think there are people here who participated. Astronomy had about 2,500 people, 48% women. Interesting figures, don't you think, of who decided to respond to the survey. For all disciplines in Africa, only just over 1,000, who was 61% women. And we held an African workshop at Ames to contribute to the questionnaire. We put in new questions like, what is the effect of health and conflict on your life as a scientist? And We unfortunately didn't get good enough stats to disaggregate physics and Africa because it has to be confidential. A gender survey has to be confidential. So any cell in the survey that has less than 5 people, the data is not analyzed or not disaggregated. So I'm going to whip through the methodology on the data-backed study of publication practice. This was concerning peer-reviewed publications, but also archive. Peer-reviewed publications, I've always fought against this because I come from a background where if you do something and make impact, it's valuable. But I recognize that in academic circles, if you publish something and someone quotes it, it's valuable. So acknowledgement of contributions to science do come through publications, ridiculous though it may be, because you didn't actually do anything in many cases. Sorry. Authorship is used in individual performance, in hiring and promotion, and in institutional achievement. The participation of women changes with time. There's no gender gap in publication, underrepresented female authors in high-ranked journals. And I'd like to compare astrophysics and astronomy with theoretical physics. Now, this is a transdisciplinary thing of data science, scientometry, gender studies, and sociology. I'm really sorry that my font has escaped me here. So people of all these specific domains were involved. Categorization of gender, there is a contrast between one's internal perception of gender and perhaps an external or assigned perception of gender. And this was inference of binary gender only because of the way it was done, as you'll see in a moment. Problems with statements about societal issues based on metadata. This was well written up, and there is a paper which is referred to somewhere. There can be a significant bias, which I'll talk about in a moment. None of us want to be data points. And there is eventually the reference. So there can be a selection bias. This was a snowball survey, a bias towards the most accessible subsets. That's why Africa didn't show up, even though we did make efforts to communicate the survey and get the results back through, for example, Facebook, which is used in Africa considerably more than other communications. Exclusion bias, there could be distortion towards certain groups. One has to examine everything critically. Fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning was an area of expertise of Mihailovic and Santa Maria, who did this. Yes, the observation does change the experiment in this case. The usage of the research can cause all sorts of problems. Objectification. I see you as a woman, not as a scientist. A risk of misuse. Suppose you have a lower publication productivity in terms of numbers of papers. Is that a reason to justify a lack of women at the higher levels? Or grant holders, for that example, and this data exists. And I'm sorry about the font again, but Dave Walker, ADM Walker, said the existence of a number does not necessarily mean that anything has been measured. Also said, and he meant man in the general sense, one man's noise is another man's signal. So why do we attempt this? Because academia, and particularly universities, are not gender agnostic. There are gender differences, and we are essentially inquiring minds. We want to know what's going on here and what can be done about it. So an authorship is each pair of an author with a publication. That is an instance of authorship. A cohort is a group of individuals that share the year of first publication. We don't really need to know that here. And a fractional authorship, if one has n authors, is 1 over n. And automated gender inference is tagging author names, female, male, or unknown. And this primarily affects names from certain regions. For example, Chinese names are transliterated. There was considerable work done on validating what was happening here. Selection bias in removing unknown authors. It turns out that one has a predominance of unknown authors among male authors rather than female authors, which places an upper limit on female authorships. And there we have it. Unknown names are more likely to be associated with men. So geoinformation was also extracted from Stanford NER, from GeoNames, from Sermine, and an interactive database is in place. And the data went from gender APT to genderized Python guesser to a Soviet surname disaggregator. And this was an interesting data project, and here's the puzzle. This is a result that made me wonder what was happening. I think you can see that the orange curve at the top is astrophysics. Now, these are papers from arXiv. So one can ask all sorts of questions about this. I'm just going to find something to drink. No, that's my umbrella. Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. Does the microphone still work? It does. So that top curve is from astrophysics. The other curves are high energy, condensed matter, relativity, quantum cosmology, nonlinear sciences, physics, and quantum physics. Quite a lot of theoretical physicists there. These are fractional authorships, 1/n authorships, and there is something happening in astrophysics that is not happening in those other subdisciplines. And we don't know what it is. So essentially, I'm here to ask you about that. There are some theories, but no work has been done on this as far as I'm aware. That is the central picture of this presentation. Now we come to a couple of more complicated things. I'd just like to point out that this only ran up to 2019, that this is proportion of authorship. This is authorships, not fractional authorships, and it's from arXiv. Now let's look at some top journals. What are top journals? The survey respondents were asked to name the top journals in their fields. I won't make a gargling noise. These are now fractional authorships, 1/n. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have astronomy and astrophysics. Actually, there's a little bit of chemistry in there. And on the right-hand side, we have theoretical physics. And I'll show you these numbers a little bit more closely. I'm going to look at Nature on the left and PhysRef D on the right, but the curves are pretty much the same. So here we have Nature on the left in astronomy and astrophysics only, and chemistry, and theoretical physics on the right, PhysRef D. And what we're seeing is a steady climb in the number of authorships of women, the percentage authorships of women, from somewhere near 5% in 1970 up to about 20% in 2017, 2019. That is the data on the same graph, same data. And PhysRef D is very different. It has, it's starting from a sort of comparable level, but it's going up as far as about 10%. This is the second part of the puzzle. Why is this the case? If one looks at all these top journals, the same sort of thing is happening across the board here. The red arrows indicate Nature on the left and PhysRef D on the right. And so once again, I'm interested to know what's going on here. Right. So you might say, well, perhaps women in theoretical physics submit less, but the survey covered your submission practices. How many submissions have you made in recent years? That's self-reported data, the number of submissions along the horizontal axis, and the frequency up the side axis. And the difference is shown either as dark orange or light orange for women and men, respectively. And those are not that different. So what happened here? Okay, maybe the stats were bad. So go back one, I think, yep. Going back one. I'm having some interesting times. On the left are the stats for how many papers were analyzed in astronomy and astrophysics. Go down the bullets about halfway to authorships. About just under 3 million authorships were analyzed in this data. And the authorships in theoretical physics were just about 4.5 million. So these should give us reasonable stats. Right, now let's say, why do we have this contrast between disciplines? In health sciences, which we might compare with natural, mathematical, and computational sciences, women have outnumbered men in MBCHB enrollments since 2000. We're actually looking at ways to encourage men to take up surgery and general practice in medicine because there isn't a good balance there. And I must say, I'm profoundly against the exclusion of men from meetings in this subject and anyone else, right? 2019 of medical doctors, men were about 60%, women about 40%. Not a bad balance, one might say. I haven't analyzed the membership of SAIP, that's why it's in bold. I went to sleep last night instead. Physical sciences and life sciences. We know anecdotally that there's a contrast there. And now we have contrasts within disciplines as well. So something is going on here that's a bit interesting. Now I'm going to go into the second half of the talk. This is, there may be women attending and men attending and members of minority groups in the workplace attending who would like to know a bit about the phenomena that occur that are very well known. And so I'm going to run through a few of them quite fast. Okay. One of the useful tools is called in the United States a scissors chart. It has along the horizontal axis seniority, essentially anything from age to from studentship to professorship. And in the United States, it usually looks like a pair of scissors because you start with more women than men. And of course, the colors don't correspond in those two graphs. And then gradually the percentage of women in the field declines with seniority. I have never seen a country where this did not happen. And that includes all the women in physics conferences, which usually have about 70 or 80 countries attending. These graphs look similar, except that where they start. In South Africa, I did this in 2013 for the CSR. On the right-hand side, women started at about 25%. And then their percentage in the lab essentially declined with age. Right. So that is the same plot. We can also look at level of seniority, but we can aggregate data. That's what the pale blue indicates. Or we can look at a cohort, which is a slice, which is blue-green. This is the second law, or a third law, consequences of getting out of the game. Nobody really has figured out how to survey people who have left the discipline, right? So you don't know why they've left the discipline. And it is very hard to come back. A couple of other things, gender schemas. Now, you know what a stereotype is. A gender schema is a broader concept. It's a hypothesis about how we recognize other people. In this case, a gender schema is women and men in the binary sense. Apologies again for binary only. And they extend to performance at work. Perhaps it is thought in many environments that women are nurturative in terms of the schema and men are agentic in terms of the schema. The negative aspects of a schema are stereotypes, but it's a new term. And one way of illustrating that was to put a schema in terms of perception of color. on the screen. This is, it's the way that many people think about gender schemas, right? Okay, now here are a couple of other useful concepts. Identity. Top left is from the History of Physics in South Africa. It's a photograph of a department, and it seems reasonable to be that the lady in the center is probably a secretary. So identity is different. Who am I? On the right is Japan. Salarymen are always dressed in white shirts, dark pants, and you are a little different if you're a woman. Science identity happens to many young people who take up science, and we have hugely different kinds of scientists. The next one is unconscious bias. Of course, you don't know if you have an unconscious bias, but in selection committees that I've run of projects, you always come back and look at your results and say, are we showing a bias here? And then another one is cumulative advantage. It might be that a head of department is kind and lets women do less challenging things so they have more time with their family. But that little 2% disadvantage increases the gap over the years. And that affects salary, promotion, and prestige. So I thought I'd put in a little bit of anecdotal work as well. It turns out that the fraction of women snaps back what it used to be when initiatives stop. You can see this when a head of department changes. And I'm going to quote Moira Bird from Chemistry at WITS, that academic life is much tougher on women than it is on men, than in industry, and she's been in both. Simon Cannell, who was an executive member of Women in Physics in South Africa, the underlying culture hasn't changed. David Wolf, who ran the physics department in New Mexico, would fly off to universities, find out who their top female students were, and offer them bursaries and bring them back. And the moment that he retired, the numbers snapped back to the way they were. So, getting through the obstacles. Here are some suggestions. The first thing is if the environment is a safe one in which to raise concerns and vitally to address them, you're away. If it's not a safe environment, if the leader is going to come down on you, and I've known cases where this happens, it's not going to work. It's got to be a safe environment to raise concerns. Personal safety is a big issue. WITS is an urban campus. I try not to be there after sundown. Fairness, absolutely top. So the safe environment, access to research and study funding, cordial relationship with colleagues, recognition of achievements. Sometimes achievements are not recognized depending on who you are. And I should know this from membership panels for the Academy of Science of South Africa. Flexible hours, help everybody. Men are parents too. A sympathetic boss. Okay, so a couple of commonly encountered problems are the two-body problem, in which two partners in a relationship are looking for jobs in the same discipline. The Dean's Dilemma, which is, why should I give up my dreams for this? Showcasing. Look, we've got a woman in every committee. The dissenting voice. If the dissenting voice is not allowed, then this can cause considerable problems. So one must be able to raise and hear the dissenting voice. Imposter syndrome. Women with outstanding achievements still have an internal belief that they're not really bright. Yes, I've seen this in colleagues. Then what can we do about this? So there are brilliant guides out there on what to do. Right, that one should read Formation of a Group. means that you are not alone. You'd be surprised how many people who are minorities in the workplace think that only they have these problems. Career break management, careful career break management. Codes of practice. Okay, so there is a set of things called Athena Swan, which led to Juno, which led to HE Advance in the in what is the United Kingdom called now? It used to be the United Queendom, right? But in the United Kingdom, your department can ask for evaluation and be granted bronze, silver, or gold in terms of gender practices. IUPAP has the Waterloo Charter for Gender Inclusion and Diversity in Physics, and some of the actions are like these. Actions that help people to stay in science because the environment is encouraging. I mean, this sounds so simple, right? But it isn't that simple. And returning to physics from a career break. I'm not going to go through all the text, and I'm just going to pick up the first in the Waterloo one is standards for candidates published. You'd be surprised how many people don't do this. Women participating in the selection process. Women are socialized in a similar way to men, I'm told. So there have been studies that show that women will also pick men if the name or a genderized name is available. And this is one of the takeaway things. It's seen as a movement by women, but it's time for adaptation, especially of academia, for society to move towards what is needed for all of us to make a better work environment. And that's from Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who also famously was not awarded the Nobel Prize. Then the second one is in career paths, hiring, and work-life balance. We appear to have different pacing of careers because people take care, and there are traditions about who in the family takes care of older and younger family members, career breaks, dual career households, provision for daycare, family leave, time off, re-entry. And the classic career path, which goes BSc, honors, masters, PhD, couple of postdocs into academia, simply does not work for everybody because it goes honors, baby, masters, baby. And who gets to look after the baby? We are seeing data that says more men are doing family and household tasks these days. And that was in that survey. And the reasons that we're told are unsupportive work environments, lack of role models, and insufficient opportunity for recognition of performance. Right, I'm just going to digress for a moment. This is a little bit from an article on college choices in the USA, which looked at common attributes that cut across academic disciplines that were predictive factors of taking majors. And about 20 university subjects were set up with different orientations, which included math orientation, science orientation, and so on. And the one, which was a good predictor, was perceived gender bias against women, emerging as a dominant predictor of the gender balance in college majors. So my question is this a possible explanation for the theoretical physics publication graphs? If you don't look like Einstein, should you be in theoretical physics? The perception of being math or science oriented was less important. There's another one. I do know people who've left the field because of harassment. I see my font has done interesting things. In physics, of those 32,000 women, respondents, 2% of men reported sexual harassment, 29% of women. And that was ill-defined in terms of sexual harassment. In Africa, it was 4% of men, 22% of women. And yes, this does happen. And yes, it has to stop. And the policy and implementation is so bad at the moment that careers end, so it has to stop before it starts. So one really needs to change the society and what is possible, particularly in the workplace. Right, the institutional and cultural issues. Yes, it can be a cultural issue, a mismatch with the majority culture, implicit norms and expectations of behavior. Now, it was a while before I actually became interested in this subject. And I think one of the reasons why that was the case was that I like cars. I like going out for beer on a Friday night. I knew I could drive faster than any of my colleagues and consume more beers. And this is very irritating to my family. But it was a norm in which I fitted, right? Young engineers, all of them about 10 years younger than me. Right. Policy is fine and dandy. We're very good at it. The theory is that it's linear, policy to strategy to vision to mission to aims to plan to implementation. And this is the way government works, university work, organizations work. But actually, it doesn't work like that. That's why we have such trouble implementing it. Any engineer, and I've spent 30 years in an engineering environment, you would never do it like that. You would test it, for goodness sake. You test it to see if it breaks or flies. In my case, you test it to see if it flies. And if it doesn't, you go back to the drawing board. So there has to be a design cycle on this kind of stuff. Good grief, you know. Right, so summing up, an environment. This, for me, is not about policy. This is about creating an environment with shared interests in success. Codes of practice, helpful guides, but test. Awareness of what is actually happening. Unconscious bias, accumulation of disadvantage, problems that we have in common, and the fact that you are not alone in your experiencing these problems. And where are we going then? Let's hope for an environment that is excellent and stimulating and fun to work in. And that is the end. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Igle. You didn't need the reminder of 15 minutes. It's 15 minutes now.
Good.
So we have plenty of time for questions. Please, let's start at the back.
Yeah, I think one of the figures, the PRD submission figures with a histogram.
Yes.
Maybe there's a problem. I mean, you say the number of women and men submitting PRD paper is almost the same if you look at the histogram.
It wasn't PRD. This was general. Just getting back to that one. I may have gone through this. It's that figure, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So this was top journals. So in the survey, it was please name the top journals in your field. And now please tell us how many submissions you have made in the last 5 years. How many articles you have submitted to journals that are top ranked in your field. Right, there's a problem.
So I mean, this top journal would include all like physics, mathematics, and biology, everything.
Yes.
Every science.
Yes.
Okay, then there's no problem because certainly there are areas that have more women than men, and that balance out the theoretical physics, which has more men than women.
Absolutely. Point taken.
I would like to ask you something related to the classic career paths.
Yes.
That you mentioned on one of the slides. And there was a remark behind that women suffer more in this system than men do, or something similar.
Yes.
And I think it's very important to realize that also men suffer in this ever increasing emphasis on parameters and key performance indicators. And this ever increasing emphasis increases faster than say the results of our efforts to treat women on an equal basis bear fruit. So isn't it important to also try to go forward to a more qualitative assessment of how good somebody is, and in that way also at the same time score better on the front of the gender balance?
This is an unqualified yes. I have worked in Sweden where both parents are essentially expected to be involved in parenting. So the gender difference is very much smaller. I am concerned about counting papers as a method of deducing quality. Many people are concerned about this. The question that always comes up is, what does one do instead? Yes, I've engaged with this to some extent. It's not easy to engage with because in South Africa, the amount of money that is tied up in the Department of Higher Education and Training subsidy for papers is far bigger than any other source of research funding in South Africa. If I'm not mistaken, it's about 6 billion rand. I could be wrong by an order, not by an order of magnitude, but it is between 2 and about 6 billion rand. If you tinker with that without testing it, which is what is likely to happen, then you could have effects that were unexpected. One of the alternatives is, there's a set of alternatives. One is to use altmetrics, which is still scientometrics. One is to use all sorts of other parameters like patents. And I've seen that in my previous life as an employed person. What happens is there are people who will chase all the objectives. So they will try to win teaching awards, publish papers, do patents, start up companies, and you end up with mediocre performance because people aren't free to do the very innovative thing. The next one is to do performance evaluations in a completely different way, where an agreement is made on what should be accomplished in the next year, barring pandemics and disasters. And the promotion is based on whether those things were achieved. But what nobody ever says is, or something even better was done that wasn't on the list. And so in this, this debate, I've always fought for putting the questions, the question on the list, what else was done? At the CSR, one of my colleagues was involved in the Nobel Prize for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But the fact that he was part of a Nobel Prize winning group wasn't on the list. So when the score comes through, it doesn't regard that. So there has to be a question, what else did you do? But I thoroughly agree that our assessment procedures are flawed. Also, I have an example from Taiwan, but I think the paper was in Chinese and it was never translated, of choices made on interviews for PIs on projects. And it miraculously turned out that there was a gender balance. Thanks. That's a good question.
I guess continuing a bit on, I mean, this general discussion, but also the last comment, I think South Africa is a bit alone in this sort of gamesmanship and just counting papers. So for example, in France, which is, you know, by far not the perfect system, you know, at least in the CNRS, if you apply for a promotion, you know, you get a certain number of pages to write about whatever you think are the strengths of what you did. And then you list 5 papers and the people are supposed to, rapporteur are supposed to read those papers. And I think there's no substitution for actually reading and looking at a person's work, you know, so that that would lead to better decisions. I mean, there's some risks of bias and that kind of thing, and you know that has to be addressed. But I think something more flexible, and you know something that doesn't just promote gamesmanship with sort of distorted incentives is really needed.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. When I'm cited, it is not clear to me whether the paper has actually been read or not. And it would be such a joy if somebody read the paper. So when someone suggests a correction, that is magnificent.
Please.
It's clearly important to be able to articulate and analyze specifically in relative terms all the issues that you have raised. But I'm a bit surprised that there doesn't seem to be much of an attempt to analyze the impact of our schooling system on how the whole scenario unfolds. There must be work on that.
There is. I don't know about it. I didn't include it. That's my fault. It's not an area that I know much about. Anecdotally, one certainly hears of people whose teachers told them, but girls can't do maths. And those comments made by teachers or parents are profoundly influential. I thoroughly agree. Not my field, but extremely important, and I should have mentioned it.
And if I may remark, so far we had 100% questions asked by men.
Yep.
No, not Yingsha. We need a
This is
question from a
brilliant.
woman. Any volunteers? Do we have questions from our online participants? Sorry, I didn't check that.
Yeah, also a comment, just I want to hear from any women or females in the audience if possible.
That's what this
Here we
is
go.
about.
Here we go.
Yeah, I'm always wondering whether, so you have an environment, and in this environment things happen, but these two influence each other. And I always wonder whether a big aspect of this environment is that we have a university, and a university does research as only one of its many functions. Teaching undergraduates is a big function, and training postgraduates is a big function. But these things get separated from each other, and they get evaluated differently with research due to the fact that a paper brings in money, which the researcher doesn't get, but the university gets. That gets raised on a platform, whereas anything you do in teaching is not really valued as much. And I sometimes ask myself whether this also has an influence, because now that's anecdotal, but women tend to be passionate about the teaching and the guidance and the mentoring aspect. Not that men don't do that, but I'm always wondering about whether, what would a university have looked like if it was, let's say, female dominated, and whether you would have these categories and whether it wouldn't help to integrate the things more. So I don't know whether it's a question, but maybe you can know something about that
Once again, this isn't something that I know a great deal about, but I'm aware that huge advances are made in physics education, for example, and I just use physics as the example that I know, which don't necessarily turn, there are two communities, the physics education specialists and those who apply physics education in their everyday lives. And as far as I'm aware, it's the papers in physics education that are recognized, not the success of the classes, but I don't know the university environment very well yet. I've come in from essentially industry. And I think the answer is probably yes, that if one were to change the balance, or to change the financial balance, that would make a difference, because money does make a difference. If, for example, the subsidy per first year was passed on in some way to an individual, in the same way that the subsidy per publication is passed on. First of all, it's a bureaucratic nightmare. And secondly, I don't know if it would change anything. I'm inclined to think that I don't have an idea for a better system. And that is what one's always asked for.
So I always have infinite questions when I go to a talk. So I think I always think about this gender kind of imbalance issue as an issue of societal aspect, like what you said, coupled with some intrinsic difference between different genders. Because we have to admit that women and men are different. We have to admit that people's brain are different to some level. And often, especially when you say theoretical physics, often when I teach a course related to theoretical physics, I find the women students, some of them, I mean, are really good, but some of them, they are a little bit struggling of understanding the abstract concept, etc. But on the other hand, they are very good in language study. They are very good in aesthetic view, all of these things, etc., which I'm not good at, etc. We have to admit that people's brain are different. So in that sense, I think my question is, if you strip out all of the societal issue and just to allow everyone to have an equal opportunity to grow, what would be your percentage of women working in theoretical physics?
Aha, that is a very interesting question. I don't know about the brain research, but I'm inclined to think that when it comes to theoretical physics, we have examples of excellent work by both sexes, and I'll use the biological term there. I would not like to think that I am constrained in terms of my brain, or that you are constrained in terms of your brain. I think we can probably look through the literature for this kind of thing. But opening up theoretical physics to both makes a heap of good sense to me. Changing the environment so that it is as inviting for anyone who wants to do it is the way to find this out.
There's one question online.
Please, Donovan, go ahead.
So a comment and a question from Isabel Kolber. I would add one aspect related to the notion of allies. Changing the culture has to come from within, as you said. But this means that men and white people sitting on hiring committees need to speak up for minorities. The value of even a simple statement like, actually, she is very good, cannot be understated. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. It's almost an insult. Actually, she's very good for a girl, right? That is the kind of thing that makes me see red. I've sat on hiring committees, and yes, this goes for race as well as gender, and for many other qualities of humans as well. And speaking up, if you're a junior person on a selection committee, can be very difficult, but that is where having a group helps you, because you go back to your group and they say, so what did you do? And you say, well, look, I just kept quiet because my evaluation is coming up, right? I know what that feels like. You have to speak up, and it's painful, and it can affect your prospects. And that's why it has to be a safe environment. Igle said this when we were interviewing that guy. Maybe she's not the kind of person who would fit in so well at higher levels. So I utterly agree. First of all, I've seen it happen. And secondly, this is something that we have to change. We have to make an environment where you can speak up. We speak up without that instant hesitation of, how will this affect me?
Christina, please.
there is one easy way well, in trying to address some of these problems, and that is making committees less horizontally structured and more vertically structured. So when we appoint a new whatever, why shouldn't there be somebody from the administrative staff on the committee? Why shouldn't there be a junior lecturer, a new person who has just started on the committee? You know, in contrast to just having all the professors who are top of the different research groups on the committee. That's my bit of it.
Yes, hallelujah. Having early career staff on selection committees would be brilliant. And I would bring to this a couple of experiences. One is that of Richard Feynman with the O-ring disaster on the shuttle, where he said, essentially, if you talk to the engineers, they thought that the chance of a catastrophe of that kind, of the loss of the entire shuttle and its human crew, was 1 in 10. Managers thought perhaps 1 in 100. The next level up thought 1 in 1,000. By the time you were getting towards the administrators at the top of NASA, they were talking to people about catastrophes 1 in 10,000. And I've seen this on reviews. The reviews that I've been on, you have to ask the students. You have to get the first year students in there. The Vice Chancellor will tell you that everything is going beautifully. So will the Dean. The head of department will talk about some things that are important to get right. The professors and will have a slightly different point of view from the early career lecturers, because the junior lecturers will talk to you, especially in South Africa, about contract hires, about not being able to make progress, about devoting 150% of their time to teaching, and you don't then have the 50% that you would normally use for research, so you cannot advance. If you talk to the senior students, they're usually doing pretty well. They're looking forward to that graduation. You talk to the honors students, they will tell you that the lab is locked in the evening, that you can't get into the library, that it's unsafe on campus, that the electricity is off half the time. And if you inquire, you find that's because the electricity bill hasn't been paid, which happened in one particular case. So one has to take that vertical sample to understand what's going on. And that's why it's so important, if there is a group formed, to include people at all levels, to include people of different genders. Simon Cannell was on the Women in Physics executive, for example, and the perspectives are valuable.
Sorry, there's one more question.
Yeah, please, Donovan, go ahead with the online questions.
Short question. How could we engage women and younger girls in science, connecting them across the globe? More question, I guess.
So there are a number of attempts to do this. I've just heard about initiatives to set up mentorships across continents for graduate students. That is relatively easy now, at least while we have the internet. Remember, I'm also casting my mind 100 years into the future. Is it an infinite resource? I'm not sure. But we might have a Carrington event which would take it down for a week, something like that. For girls at school, one of the most important things is to talk with teachers, not to teachers, about their experiences, because of those remarks that are like, oh, you wouldn't want a career in science, it's too difficult. And just request that those remarks are not made, but the other kind of remark is made. I think you're good at this. I know someone who is now a group executive at the CSR because a teacher said to him halfway through his schooling career, I think you're good at maths. And he takes that as a defining moment in his life. The next one is to understand from leadership what the issues are, and to work on retention, not only attraction, but retention of women in science. If, for example, one comes back from a career break for whatever reason, you are behind on the curve. What are we going to do about that? We have to think hard about this kind of thing. Otherwise, people, often parents, don't come back from a career break. I don't know if that answers the question. I'm happy to know if there's any feedback on
I think it's a good answer. Just one short question. Should we as a society strive for equality of outcome or equality of opportunity?
I think there's an or in that sentence. And I'm reminded of my father, who asked when he wanted ice cream or trifle, would say, yes, please. It's a yes, please. We'd like both excellence and equity. And equity is different from equality.
I think this ice cream note is a very nice place to stop. So thank you very much, Igle, for a very interesting talk that will give us lots of to think about, yeah, and lots of things to do, probably.